Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Fear. It's been 3 summers now, but the memory of the Appalachian Trail still tightens a knot in my stomach. I was 28 then, fresh out of a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Colorado, and brimming with the naive confidence of youth. To celebrate, I'd planned a solo hiking trip, a seemingly idyllic trek along the Appalachian Trail. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I call Denver home. Having conquered my fair share of challenging terrain in the Rockies, I truly believed the gentler, rolling mountains of the East Coast would be a refreshing, easygoing change of pace. I couldn't have been more wrong about what those ancient hills held in store for me. My journey began in Virginia, with an ambitious goal of covering about 50 miles over 5 days, winding through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The first 2 days unfolded like a dream. The trail was impeccably marked, the weather was perfect, and I was making excellent progress, easily averaging 12 miles daily. I'd set up camp at designated sites, reveling in the profound solitude. The Appalachian wilderness possesses a distinct, almost mystical aura compared to the Rockies. While Colorado's majestic peaks feel young and sharp, these eastern hills felt ancient, heavy with countless generations of history. There was a palpable sense of something watchful in the very air, a quiet presence I couldn't quite articulate. On the 3rd morning, a jolt of alarm shot through me. My GPS device was utterly dead. I distinctly remembered the battery being full the night before, and even stranger, my brand new backup power bank refused to work. Still, I carried paper maps and a compass, so I wasn't overly concerned. The trail was clearly defined by white blazes painted on trees every few hundred yards. What, I thought, could possibly go wrong? I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when he appeared. I was taking a water break in a small clearing, enjoying the quiet, when this man emerged from the dense woods, almost as if he'd been expecting me. He looked to be in his 40s, dressed in faded camouflage pants and a tattered flannel shirt. His long, greasy hair was tied back in a ponytail, and a thick, untamed beard, untouched for months, obscured most of his face. His eyes were what struck me most, a pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky just before a storm. "You look lost, friend," he remarked, a peculiar statement given I was standing right beside a prominent trail marker. I assured him I was merely resting, but he kept talking. He introduced himself as Billy, claiming he'd lived in these mountains his whole life. He boasted of knowing every trail, every secret shortcut, every hidden spring and cave. His manner was superficially friendly, yet it carried an unsettling undertone, like a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Billy then proposed a far superior route than the main trail, one that would supposedly shave off about 8 miles and lead me through some of the most pristine, untouched parts of the mountains. He insisted that most hikers never truly experience the Appalachian wilderness because they confine themselves to tourist trails. He painted vivid pictures of hidden waterfalls, ancient Native American sites, and places where the mountain spirit still thrived. Every fiber of my being screamed to decline his offer. This man had materialized out of nowhere in thousands of acres of wilderness, aware I was hiking alone, and was now offering to guide me off the marked path into areas where no one would ever find me if something went wrong. Yet, he seemed so genuinely passionate about sharing his profound knowledge of the mountains. I'd always prided myself on being adventurous and open to new experiences. In hindsight, I believe what ultimately swayed me was his intimate familiarity with the area. He could pinpoint specific landmarks, name distant peaks, and even warned me about a section of the main trail washed out by recent storms. When I cross-referenced my map, everything he said was accurate. He was clearly a local, deeply rooted in these mountains, and so, against my better judgment, I agreed to follow his shortcut. The initial hour of hiking with Billy was surprisingly pleasant. He led me off the main trail onto what looked like an old logging road, now largely reabsorbed by the forest. The path was faint but discernible, winding through dense stands of oak and maple. Billy proved to be an engaging guide, identifying edible plants, pointing out deer and bear tracks, and sharing tales of the region's history. He spoke of the old mountain families who had dwelled in these hollows for generations, emphasizing their unique ways and distrust of outsiders. He recounted stories of coal mines scarring the hills decades ago, with some abandoned shafts so deep you'd never hear a stone hit bottom. Then, he casually mentioned that people still vanished in these mountains annually, mostly city folk who underestimated how easily one could get disoriented off marked trails. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, a growing sense of unease began to settle over me. We'd been hiking for over 2 hours, but none of Billy's promised landmarks, no hidden waterfalls, no ancient sites, had appeared, just an endless, monotonous forest. When I inquired, Billy claimed we were taking a longer detour due to recent landslides. Then it dawned on me, we weren't following any trail anymore. Billy was simply navigating through the woods, weaving between trees, traversing ridges with no clear destination. When I halted and asked to pinpoint our location on my map, Billy chuckled. Ed, dismissing maps as useless in this part of the mountains, given how much the terrain shifted with each storm. That's when I noticed we weren't alone. At first, I attributed it to paranoia, just fleeting movements in my peripheral vision, the snap of branches somewhere behind us. But as the afternoon wore on, I became utterly convinced that at least 2 other people were shadowing us through the woods, staying just out of sight but mirroring our pace precisely. I confronted Billy, and his entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The friendly mask evaporated, replaced by cold, calculating, pale eyes. He stated his boys were merely ensuring we didn't encounter any trouble, adding that these mountains could be dangerous for someone unfamiliar with them. When I pressed him about what kind of trouble, he simply smirked and said, "There are all sorts of predators in these woods, and some of them walk on 2 legs." I immediately told Billy I wanted to return to the main trail. He just laughed, asking if I even knew which direction that was. I glanced around, my heart sinking as I realized he was right. We'd been walking for hours through dense forest, the sun completely obscured by the thick canopy. I had utterly lost my bearings. Billy then reassured me not to worry, saying he and his boys would look after me. They had a comfortable camp nearby with hot food and cold beer. I could rest for the night, and in the morning, they'd help me find my way back to civilization. The way he uttered "help me find my way back" sent a profound chill down my spine. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was in grave danger. I was alone in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness, with a man who had intentionally led me far from any marked trails, and at least 2 others were stalking us. My GPS was dead, my phone had no signal, and I had no idea which way led to safety. I told Billy I needed to use the restroom and stepped behind a large oak tree. The moment I was out of his sight, I bolted. My only plan was to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever Billy and his companions had in store for me. Running through dense forest is nothing like running on a clear trail. Every step is precarious, branches whipped across my face, roots tripped my feet, and visibility was limited to mere yards. Behind me, I heard shouting and the unmistakable sound of multiple people crashing through the underbrush. Billy's voice echoed, calling my name, insisting I was foolish, that I'd get lost and die in these woods without his help. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was likely only 20 or 30 minutes. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, and thorns and branches had left cuts all over my arms and face. Finally, I had to stop, gasping for breath behind a fallen log. That's when I heard the whistling. It wasn't a tune, but a sharp, piercing sound, like a bird call, coming from at least 3 different directions around me. Billy and his friends were communicating, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than I did, and they were hunting me like an animal. I forced myself to keep moving, aiming uphill, remembering from my map that the main trail often followed a ridge line. If I could gain enough elevation, I might spot a landmark to orient myself. As I climbed, the whistling softened, but I could still hear it echoing through the valleys below. These men weren't giving up. They'd keep searching until they found me. And when they did, I had no doubt their intentions wouldn't end well for me. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached a ridgetop and beheld the most beautiful sight of my life, a white blaze, painted on a tree about 50 yards away. I had found the Appalachian Trail. I stumbled toward that trail marker as if it were salvation itself. Once back on the marked path, I started running again, heading south, recalling a road crossing about 5 miles in that direction. I ran until complete darkness enveloped me, using my flashlight to follow the white blazes from tree to tree. I reached the road crossing around midnight and flagged down the first car I saw. The driver, a local sheriff's deputy, took one look at my torn clothes and bleeding face and immediately asked what had happened. I recounted the entire terrifying story, and his expression grew grimmer with each detail. He informed me, chillingly, that I wasn't the first hiker to report being lured off the trail by helpful locals in that particular area. He explained that 3 missing persons cases had been filed in the past 2 years, all solo hikers who had vanished in that section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The deputy strongly suspected a group of off-grid men targeting vulnerable hikers in those woods. But the terrain, he said, was simply too rugged, the forest too vast, for them to ever track the culprits down effectively. I never discovered what Billy and his friends had planned for me, and frankly, I don't want to know. What I do know is that I narrowly escaped becoming another tragic missing person statistic in the Appalachian Mountains. I haven't hiked alone since that day, and I vow I never will again. The mountains are breathtaking, a truly magnificent display of nature's grandeur, but they conceal dangers far beyond wild animals or the simple act of getting lost. Sometimes, the most perilous predators are not beasts of the wild, but the ones who walk on 2 legs, smiling deceptively as they offer to help you find your way. The harrowing ordeal forever altered my perception of wilderness and human nature. I used to view solo hiking as the pinnacle of self-reliance and communion with nature, a test of my own capabilities. Now, it's tinged with a profound sense of vulnerability. It's not just about packing the right gear or knowing your navigation skills. It's about recognizing the dark undercurrents that can exist even in the most pristine environments. This experience serves as a stark reminder that while nature can be unforgiving, human malice can be far more terrifying and insidious. It speaks to a systemic problem in remote areas where the vastness that appeals to adventurers also provides cover for those with sinister intentions. The difficulty law enforcement faces in tracking such groups leaves a chilling void of justice and countless unanswered questions for families of the missing. My survival was a matter of instinct and sheer luck, a vivid lesson that the greatest adventure can sometimes morph into the gravest threat, changing forever how one trusts both the landscape and the people within it. Last October, when my grandfather passed away, I inherited something I never should have. My name is Rebecca Thompson, and I live in Portland, Maine. I'd always known my grandfather owned property deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, but I'd never once visited it. He simply wasn't the kind of man who'd ever discuss his past or delve into family history. When he died at 93, he left me his entire estate, including that remote cabin, a place that had apparently been in our family for over a century. My grandfather, Samuel Thompson, was born and raised in those West Virginia mountains before he relocated north in the 1950s. He almost never spoke of his childhood or his reasons for leaving. Whenever anyone in the family tried to inquire about his early life, he'd quickly change the subject or offer vague answers about seeking better opportunities up north. The few times I was persistent enough to press him for details, his eyes would grow distant, and he'd simply say some places were better left in the past. That cryptic response always sent a shiver down my spine. Even then, the estate lawyer informed me the cabin sat on 47 acres of dense forest in a hollow called Serpent's Gap, roughly 30 miles from the nearest town. He stressed that there was no electricity, no running water, and that the only access was a dirt road which became impassable in heavy rain or snow. Property taxes were minimal, he added, and the cabin hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The lawyer, rather bluntly, suggested I might simply sell the land to a timber company and forget about it entirely. But something about this mysterious family property truly intrigued me. I was between jobs at the time, having recently finished a contract with an environmental consulting firm, so I had the time. I decided to drive down to West Virginia to see what exactly my grandfather had left me. Maybe I could restore the cabin and use it as a retreat, or perhaps I'd find it utterly worthless and sell it off. Either way, I felt a strong pull to explore this piece of my family history that my grandfather had kept so stubbornly hidden for so long. The drive from Maine to West Virginia took 2 long days. I spent a night in a Beckley motel, trying to mentally prepare before heading into Serpent's Gap the following morning. The lawyer's directions led me deep into coal country, through small towns that truly seemed frozen in time, abandoned decades ago. Empty storefronts, boarded-up houses, and the occasional solitary person on a porch watched my car pass with what felt like deeply suspicious eyes. The dirt road to the cabin was barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. Tree branches scraped both sides as I wound my way deeper into the mountains, following a creek that grew narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. After about 40 minutes of careful, bone-rattling driving, I finally spotted the cabin through the thick trees. My initial impression was a surprising one. The place was in far better shape than I'd anticipated. It was a traditional log cabin, likely built in the early 1900s, with a sturdy stone chimney and a covered front porch. The roof appeared sound, and though the logs had weathered to a dark gray, the structure seemed remarkably stable. Clearly, someone had maintained this place far more recently than the lawyer had suggested. I parked beside the cabin and cautiously began to explore the property. There was an old well with a working hand pump, an outhouse that looked more recently constructed than the cabin itself, and several smaller outbuildings for storage. The forest pressed in tightly on all sides, with towering oaks and maples blocking most of the sunlight. Even at midday, the hollow felt strangely dim and enclosed, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me, until I remembered we were probably 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Inside, the cabin was furnished with simple, handmade pieces from the 1940s or 50s. There was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with no appliances, 2 bedrooms, and a main living space with shelves full of books and what looked like personal belongings. That's when the unsettling realization dawned on me. My grandfather had been returning here regularly, likely for decades. The cabin wasn't abandoned at all. There were recent additions, a battery-powered radio, canned goods with expiration dates from just a few years ago, and clothes in one of the bedroom closets that I instantly recognized as my grandfather's. This had been his secret retreat, a place he'd visited consistently without ever telling anyone in the family. I spent that first day exploring the cabin, sifting through my grandfather's possessions. Most of it was unremarkable: old hunting and fishing magazines, basic camping supplies, a few changes of clothes. But in what was clearly his bedroom, I discovered a wooden chest tucked discreetly under the bed, containing something far more intriguing and, frankly, far more disturbing. The chest was filled to the brim with old photographs, faded letters, and what appeared to be journal entries dating all the way back to the 1940s. The photographs showed my grandfather as a young man, alongside others I didn't recognize, all posed at various spots around the mountain property. There were pictures of hunting trips, family gatherings, and what looked like community events or celebrations. As I examined the photographs chronologically, I noticed something profoundly disturbing. In the earlier group shots, there were always 8 or 9 people, but as the years passed, fewer and fewer appeared, until by the 1950s, my grandfather was almost entirely alone in the pictures. Where had everyone else gone? The journal entries offered some terrifying answers, but they sparked even more troubling questions. My grandfather had meticulously documented something he called the feeding schedule. Early entries from the 1940s mentioned taking turns with other family members, ensuring someone visited the hungry place at least once a month during the warm seasons. He wrote about leaving offerings of fresh meat, usually deer or rabbit, at a specific location he referred to, chillingly, as the mouth. As I read further, a cold dread began to settle over me. I started to grasp that my grandfather and his extended family had been caretakers for something truly ancient and living in the mountains surrounding the cabin, something that required regular sustenance to keep it appeased and prevent it from venturing into the valleys where other people lived. The journal entries described this entity as ancient, something that predated white settlers in these mountains, something the Cherokee tribes had known and respected. According to my grandfather's notes, his family had forged an agreement with this entity generations ago. In exchange for keeping it fed and hidden, it would protect their land and family from harmful outsiders. But this pact, he grimly noted, came with stringent rules and dire consequences for anyone who dared to break them. The journal entries from the late 1940s detailed what happened when his cousin Robert tried to leave the mountain and move to Charleston without fulfilling his assigned feeding duties. Robert vanished on his way out of state, and his car was found a week later, utterly destroyed, with no trace of Robert himself. My grandfather wrote that they all knew what had occurred, but there was nothing they could do but continue honoring their obligations. 1. By one, family members either died or disappeared until my grandfather was the sole person left to maintain the feeding schedule. The later entries revealed his escalating desperation as he aged, realizing he might not sustain his duties much longer. He had tried to find other relatives to take over, but most had moved far away from the mountains, wanting nothing to do with what they viewed as backward superstitions. The final journal entry was dated just 3 months before my grandfather died. He wrote that he was too old and frail to make the monthly trips to the feeding place, and he could sense the thing in the mountains growing restless and hungry. He feared what might happen if no one continued the feedings after he was gone. He had decided with a clear and heavy heart to bequeath the property to me, his only granddaughter, hoping I might somehow comprehend the importance of continuing the family obligation. At the bottom of the chest, wrapped in an old canvas cloth, I found a hand-drawn map indicating the mouth's location and detailed instructions for acceptable offerings. According to his notes, the feeding place was a natural cave opening about 2 miles up the mountain from the cabin, concealed within a grove of dead trees where nothing would grow. I sat in that dim cabin, reading my grandfather's journals by the weak glow of my headlamp, trying desperately to process what I had uncovered. Part of me, the rational part, wanted to dismiss it all as the superstitious beliefs of an isolated mountain family, a dark folklore born of hardship and loneliness. But another, more visceral part of me couldn't ignore the chilling fact that my grandfather had maintained these rituals for over 60 years, long after he had moved away and built a new life in Maine. He had never spoken of it to anyone, never breathed a word to our family, yet he had never stopped returning to feed whatever resided in these mountains. The sheer commitment spoke volumes that mere words could not. As the sun finally set on my first day at the cabin, plunging the hollow into an inky blackness, I heard something that froze my blood. It began as a low humming sound, almost like singing, emanating from somewhere deep in the forest around the cabin. The sound wasn't quite human, but it possessed an unsettling intelligence, a deliberate rhythmic pattern suggesting communication rather than just mere animal noise. My heart hammering, I checked my grandfather's journal and found an entry describing precisely what I was hearing. He called it the calling song and wrote that it signified the entity in the mountains knew someone new had arrived at the cabin. It was curious about me, testing to see if I understood my responsibilities, or if I was just another ignorant outsider who would need to be dealt with. The humming persisted for about an hour, circling the cabin at a distance, never approaching close enough for me to see its source. Eventually, it faded, leaving me alone with the journal, the unsettling silence, and the dawning, terrifying realization that I had inherited far more than just a cabin and 47 acres of mountain property. I had inherited a family curse, passed down for generations, and something hungry was waiting in the darkness to see what I would do about it. The chilling implications of that sound, that ancient, curious humming, echoed in my mind long after the last vibration died away. Sleep felt impossible, a distant dream. I was no longer just Rebecca from Portland, Maine, an environmental consultant between jobs. I was now the last link in a centuries-old chain, bound by a terrible pact to a nameless horror. The choice was clear, yet agonizing. Accept this monstrous inheritance and continue the gruesome tradition, or break the pact and face consequences far more dreadful than anything my rational mind could conceive. The mountains, it seemed, were watching, waiting, and I could feel their immense, unseen pressure already settling heavy on my soul. Let me be clear from the start. I was young, foolish, and driven by a thirst for adventure when all of this unfolded 5 years ago. My name is Tyler Kowalski, and I hail from Chicago. I was just 21, wrapping up my junior year at Northwestern University, deeply engrossed in my journalism studies. I harbored this rather romanticized notion, you see, of unearthing authentic American stories in places tourists simply never ventured. So, that spring break, instead of joining my fraternity brothers in Cancun for the usual revelry, I chose a different path. I embarked on a road trip through the rugged heart of rural Appalachia, convinced I could write compelling articles about the true mountain culture still thriving in those remote, forgotten hollows. I devoured books and articles about the legendary moonshine tradition, a practice supposedly alive and well in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, despite its illegality for nearly a century. My goal wasn't to find the sanitized, tourist trap version sold in kitschy gift shops. No, I craved the real thing. genuine white lightning, crafted by families who had been distilling corn liquor since before Prohibition, their methods passed down through generations. I genuinely believed that if I could access that world, write about it authentically and respectfully, it would make a fantastic piece for the campus newspaper, perhaps even catching the eye of some major publications. My first week was spent navigating tiny mountain towns, striking up conversations with locals in greasy diners and dusty gas stations, all in a relentless search for leads on traditional moonshiners. Most people either feigned ignorance or, more frustratingly, gave me vague directions to legal, utterly bland tourist distilleries. But then, in a town called Colton, West Virginia, a genuine lead finally surfaced. I was savoring breakfast at a truck stop diner when I couldn't help but overhear two men at the next table. They were discussing someone named Old Pete, who was apparently struggling with his latest batch. I caught snippets about the copper being off and the need to start over before the revenuers got wind of it. When they eventually got up to leave, I knew this was my chance. I followed them outside and introduced myself, explaining I was a college student researching Appalachian culture, subtly emphasizing my keen interest in traditional mountain crafts and customs. The older of the two men, who later introduced himself as Dale, scrutinized me with a gaze that felt like it could pierce steel. He had a face etched with the lines of someone who had spent their entire life under the open sky, hands gnarled and calloused, and clothes that carried the unmistakable scent of tobacco and motor oil. After several minutes of careful, almost unnerving, questioning about my true motives, he seemed to reach a silent decision about me. Dale finally told me that if I was genuinely serious about understanding mountain culture, I needed to see how things were still done the old way, by people who had never abandoned their grandfather's time-honored methods. He then mentioned a man named Pete Hartley, who ran a traditional operation deep in Bent Creek Hollow, perhaps 30 miles further into the mountains. Dale, however, issued a stern warning. Pete was profoundly wary of outsiders and absolutely despised unannounced visitors. But, Dale added, if he personally vouched for me, Pete might be willing to show me around and answer a few questions. I agreed immediately, probably with an eagerness that was entirely too transparent, because Dale gave me a long, serious look. He stressed, with an edge to his voice, that I needed to fully comprehend that what Pete was doing remained illegal, even if it was deeply traditional. He made it chillingly clear that if I planned to write anything that could potentially draw law enforcement attention to Pete's operation, Dale would personally ensure I regretted it. The way he said it wasn't an overt threat, not exactly, but the message was unmistakable. These mountain people protected their own, and they certainly didn't take kindly to betrayal from city folk they'd mistakenly trusted. Dale instructed me to meet him the very next morning at a gas station on the outskirts of Colton, and he would drive me to Pete's place. He also advised bringing cash if I wanted to purchase any samples and, perhaps more importantly, to be prepared to keep my mouth shut about anything I saw that wasn't directly related to the moonshine-making process. The next morning, I met Dale at the gas station exactly as planned. He was behind the wheel of a beat-up pickup truck, a vehicle that looked like it was held together by little more than duct tape and fervent prayers, yet its engine ran with a surprisingly smooth, quiet hum. We drove deeper into the mountains than I had ever ventured before, following increasingly narrow and rough roads that snaked through dense forests and past the skeletal remains of abandoned coal mines. After about 45 minutes, Dale abruptly turned onto what I initially mistook for a forgotten hiking trail. It was, in fact, a dirt road, barely wide enough for the truck, and we bounced and lurched our way up a steep mountainside, tree branches scraping loudly against both sides of the vehicle. Dale explained that Pete's operation was tucked far back in the woods, deliberately distant from any main roads, ensuring that the telltale smoke from his still would never be visible to authorities. When we finally reached Pete's place, I was genuinely surprised by the elaborate setup. Several buildings were scattered around a natural clearing, a sturdy traditional log cabin, a larger shed that was clearly the distillery, and smaller outbuildings for storage and equipment. The entire operation was remarkably concealed beneath a thick forest canopy, utterly invisible from the air, and accessible only by the impossibly rough road we had just navigated. Pete Hartley himself perfectly embodied the image of a traditional moonshiner. He appeared to be in his 60s, sporting a long, scraggly gray beard and eyes that held a suspicious glint, seemingly absorbing every minute detail of my appearance and demeanor. He wore faded overalls and a flannel shirt that had undoubtedly seen better decades, yet he carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man utterly at peace in his own domain. Dale introduced me simply as the college boy he mentioned, and Pete offered a curt nod, his enthusiasm clearly lacking. He grudgingly agreed to show me his operation and answer some questions, but he made it unequivocally clear that I was there solely as Dale's guest and shouldn't expect any special treatment just because I was supposedly writing a school paper. The moonshine operation itself was utterly fascinating from both a historical and cultural perspective. Pete utilized methods and equipment that had been meticulously passed down through 4 generations. The still, in particular, was a true work of art, a complex tangle of gleaming copper pipes and meticulously calibrated components that Pete had built himself, relying on the ancient knowledge his grandfather had imparted to him. He patiently explained the entire intricate process, from carefully selecting the right corn and ensuring proper fermentation, to expertly managing the distillation temperature and precise timing. Pete was clearly passionate about his craft, taking immense pride in producing what he confidently claimed as some of the finest white lightning in the entire region. He even allowed me to sample several different batches, detailing the subtle flavor variations that resulted from minute changes in ingredients and technique. The moonshine was incredibly potent, far stronger than anything I had ever tried, and I could feel its fiery warmth burning all the way down to my stomach. As the afternoon wore on, more people began to arrive at Pete's compound. They came in battered pickup trucks and noisy ATVs, all navigating the same rough road Dale and I had taken. Pete introduced them casually as customers and friends, locals who had been buying his moonshine for years. They were cordial enough towards me, but I couldn't shake the sense that they were all watching me carefully, their eyes assessing, trying to discern if I could truly be trusted with their deeply held secrets. That's when I made my first incredibly foolish mistake. I had brought a small digital camera, intending to use it for my article, and I innocently asked Pete if I could photograph some of the equipment, perhaps even get a shot of him working at the still. Pete immediately refused, his expression hardening, but I, in my youthful naivety, pressed him. I tried to explain that pictures would genuinely help readers understand the traditional craft and the unique culture I was documenting. Several of the other men exchanged uneasy glances, and the atmosphere in the clearing abruptly grew thick with unspoken tension. Dale swiftly pulled me aside, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He quietly explained that I had just asked Pete to create undeniable evidence that could be used to prosecute him and shut down an operation that had been in his family for nearly a century. He very strongly suggested I put the camera away and, under no circumstances, mention it again. I apologized profusely, assuring everyone I absolutely understood their concerns about photography. The palpable tension seemed to ease somewhat, and we resumed discussing the history and traditions of moonshine production in the region. Still, I could tell my ill-advised request for pictures had undeniably damaged the fragile trust Dale had worked so hard to establish on my behalf. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, more people continued to arrive at the compound. I couldn't help but notice that some of these newer arrivals carried weapons, not just hunting rifles slung casually over shoulders, but handguns tucked into waistbands, and even what looked suspiciously like military-style firearms. The conversation gradually shifted away from the nuances of moonshine production to other topics I didn't entirely grasp, but it was abundantly clear these discussions involved illegal activities far beyond simple liquor distillation. That's when I made my second, far more serious, mistake. One of the newcomers was a man in his 30s who arrived on an ATV, a large, well-worn backpack strapped securely to his back. He was conducting some kind of business with Pete that involved exchanging stacks of cash for small, discreet packages that were most definitely not moonshine. My journalistic curiosity, a dangerous trait in that moment, got the absolute better of me, and I found myself shamelessly paying close attention to their hushed conversation, straining to understand what clandestine dealings were being discussed. The man with the backpack, sharp and observant, noticed me listening intently. His eyes narrowed as he directly asked Pete who I was and why there was a complete stranger at the compound during what was clearly a sensitive business meeting. Pete tried to deflect, explaining I was Dale's guest, just a college kid writing about moonshine traditions. But the man was clearly unconvinced. He pointed out, with chilling accuracy, that I'd already tried to take pictures, and now I was obviously eavesdropping on private conversations completely unrelated to moonshine. Several of the armed men, who had been lingering in the background, now began to gather around me, forming an increasingly tight circle, and a cold dread seized my stomach. I realized, with a sickening lurch, that I was in grave trouble. These weren't just friendly mountain moonshiners showcasing their traditional craft to an interested student. This was some kind of organized criminal enterprise using Pete's remote compound as a clandestine meeting and distribution point for activities far beyond illegal liquor production. The man with the backpack stepped closer, his voice low and menacing, and directly asked me what exactly I had seen and heard since my arrival. I desperately tried to play dumb, stammering that I was only interested in moonshine and hadn't noticed anything else. But he wasn't buying it, nor were the other men who had now completely encircled me, their expressions grim. Dale, God bless him, tried to vouch for me, saying I was just a naive college kid who didn't understand the dangerous world he had stumbled into, but the damage was irrevocably done. The man with the backpack declared, with an icy finality, that bringing an outsider to the compound during a business meeting was a serious security breach, and there needed to be consequences to ensure it never, ever happened again. That's when they brought out the rope and the old metal chair, and in that horrifying moment, I realized with absolute certainty that I was about to become an object lesson in what happened to people who saw too much in these unforgiving mountains. Pete looked genuinely regretful, his gaze filled with a somber sadness for what was to come, but he didn't intervene. Dale's simple eyes shook his head, a weary resignation on his face, and reiterated that he had warned me, explicitly, to keep my mouth shut about anything unrelated to moonshine. The next few hours were, without a doubt, the most terrifying of my entire life, but miraculously, I survived. And no, I never wrote that article about traditional moonshine culture in the Appalachian Mountains. Some stories, you see, simply aren't worth telling. The experience shattered my youthful idealism, replacing my romantic notions of authentic American stories with a stark, brutal understanding of the true cost of curiosity. I went to Appalachia seeking a quaint, almost folkloric tale of defiance against Prohibition-era laws. What I found was a chilling reminder that tradition can sometimes intertwine with a far darker, more dangerous reality. The mountains that once symbolized rugged independence now held an ominous, suffocating aura for me. That day, I lost not only my camera and my naive belief in journalistic fearlessness, but also a piece of my innocence. It taught me that while some stories yearn to be told, others are best left buried in the quiet, unforgiving hollows where they belong. The memory of that rope and chair, and Pete's sorrowful, complicit gaze, remains a visceral scar, a permanent caution against the perils of venturing too far into worlds that are not your own, especially when you fail to respect their unwritten, perilous rules. My pursuit of truth was met with a terrifying lesson in survival, and it fundamentally altered my perception of risk, reportage, and the profound, often deadly secrets hidden in plain sight. I lost 3 days of my life in those mountains, and to this day, I only recall fragments of what actually transpired. My name is Amanda Foster, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. What I'm about to share with you happened 2 years ago during what should have been a simple, restorative weekend camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I consider myself a logical person, a software engineer by trade, someone who believes firmly in facts and evidence. Yet, the events that unfolded in those mountains defy every rational explanation I can possibly conjure. At the time, I was navigating a difficult divorce, and my therapist had strongly suggested engaging in solo activities to help rebuild my sense of independence and confidence. I'd always loved hiking and camping, but it had fallen by the wayside as my marriage began to unravel. So, I decided to take a long weekend, embarking on a solo road trip from Phoenix all the way to Tennessee, desperate to spend some time alone in the wilderness, exploring areas I'd never seen before. I arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The fall colors were just beginning to paint the landscape, and the weather was absolutely perfect for hiking and camping. I had reserved a backcountry campsite for 3 nights, planning to spend Friday, Saturday, and Sunday exploring some of the more remote trails before making the long drive back to Arizona on Monday. My chosen campsite was about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by hiking through dense forest along a narrow mountain path. I'd been backpacking for years and was generally comfortable with isolation, but I'd never camped quite this far from civilization. The nearest other campers were at least 2 miles away, and throughout the day, I never encountered another soul on the trails. Thursday evening, I meticulously set up my tent, cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove, and settled in for what I fully expected to be a peaceful night under a canopy of stars. I vividly remember sitting by my campfire around 9 p.m., engrossed in a book and enjoying the soothing sounds of the forest. The last clear memory I have from that first night is checking my watch at 9:47 p.m. and considering an early night so I could get a head start on hiking the next morning. The next thing I remember, with a jolt, is waking up on Sunday afternoon in a completely different location. I was lying on bare, cold ground in a grove of unsettlingly dead trees, roughly half a mile from where I'd pitched my tent. My tent, my backpack, and all of my gear were simply gone, vanished. I was still wearing the same clothes I'd put on Thursday morning, but they were filthy, torn in several places, and stiff with dried grime. My hiking boots were missing, and my feet were cut and bruised, as if I'd walked barefoot over incredibly rough terrain for hours. When I checked my watch, it was 3:30 p.m. on Sunday. I had lost almost 3 complete days, with an absolute blank where any memory should have been. My mouth was bone dry. I was incredibly hungry and felt profoundly weak, as if I hadn't eaten or had much water in days. But the strangest thing was that I didn't feel like I'd been unconscious or sick. I felt alert and aware, just utterly confused about where I was and how I'd possibly gotten there. I tried to retrace my steps back to where my campsite should have been, but nothing looked familiar. The grove of dead trees where I had awakened was unlike anything I'd seen during my hike in on Thursday. All the trees in the immediate area appeared to have died recently. Their bark was black and peeling, and nothing, absolutely nothing, grew on the forest floor beneath them. Even more disturbing, the trees seemed to have died in a perfect circle, with healthy, vibrant forest surrounding this dead zone on all sides. In the very center of the grove, there was a natural depression in the ground that looked almost like a shallow crater. The soil was dark and had an oily, unnatural texture. When I knelt to examine it more closely, I could smell something chemical and deeply unpleasant, like sulfur mixed with rotting vegetation. Carved into the largest of the dead trees were symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't letters or numbers, but intricate geometric patterns cut deep into the bark with some kind of sharp, precise tool. The cuts looked remarkably fresh, and some still oozed sap, despite the tree appearing to have been dead for months. I spent about an hour frantically searching the area for my camping gear, but found no trace of my tent, backpack, or supplies. It was as if they had simply dematerialized. Eventually, with a heavy heart, I gave up looking and tried to find my way back to the main trail so I could hike out to my car and try to piece together what had happened. That proved far more difficult than I expected. I'd hiked these mountains before and was usually quite adept at navigation, but nothing looked right. The terrain seemed fundamentally different from what I remembered from my hike-in on Thursday. Hills and ridges that I was certain should have been in specific locations were nowhere to be found. Even the sun's position seemed wrong for the time of day and season. I wandered through the forest for several hours, growing increasingly desperate and confused. I should have easily found the main trail from where I was, but every direction I tried led me deeper into unfamiliar territory. It was as if the landscape itself had been subtly, terrifyingly altered during the 3 days I couldn't remember. Just before sunset, I finally encountered another person. He was an elderly man wearing a park ranger uniform, walking alone on what appeared to be a game trail. When he saw me, his eyes widened, and he immediately asked if I was Amanda Foster, explaining that people had been looking for me since Friday morning when I failed to check in at the ranger station, as required for backcountry campers. The ranger, whose name was Bill Harris, had been part of the search team combing the area for me since Friday afternoon. He told me they had found my abandoned campsite on Saturday morning, with my tent still pitched, but no sign of me. There had been no evidence of a struggle or animal attack. I had simply vanished, without leaving any tracks or clues about my direction. Ranger Harris radioed for assistance, then escorted me back to the ranger station, where I was questioned at length by park officials and local law enforcement about what on earth had happened during those missing 3 days. The problem was, I genuinely couldn't remember anything after sitting by my campfire Thursday evening. I had no explanation for how I'd ended up in that bizarre grove of dead trees, what had happened to my camping gear, or why I had absolutely no memory of the intervening time. The medical examination at the local hospital revealed some truly disturbing findings. I had multiple small cuts and scrapes on my arms and legs that appeared to be several days old and partially healed. There were also what looked like injection sites on both of my arms, as if someone had been drawing blood or administering drugs intravenously. The blood tests came back clean for common drugs and toxins, but the doctor made it clear that hundreds of substances wouldn't show up in standard screening. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery of what appeared to be surgical scars on my scalp, hidden beneath my hair. They were small, maybe half an inch long each, and looked like they had been made with incredibly precise instruments. The doctor who examined them said they appeared recent, probably made within the past few days, but I had no memory of any medical procedures or injuries requiring such treatment. Over the following weeks, I began to experience disturbing dreams that, with terrifying clarity, seemed more like recovered memories from those missing 3 days. In these dreams, I was lying on a cold metal table in some kind of underground facility, surrounded by people in medical scrubs conducting tests and procedures I couldn't fully comprehend. There were harsh, bright lights, the low hum of electronic equipment, and conversations in voices that seemed somehow not quite human, a strange cadence that still chills me. In one particularly vivid dream, I was conscious but utterly unable to move, while someone examined my brain using equipment that looked far more advanced than anything I'd ever seen in a regular medical facility. They were inserting thin probes through the small incisions in my scalp and monitoring my responses on screens, displaying complex patterns and data. The most terrifying part of these dreams was the growing, undeniable certainty that they weren't dreams at all, but actual memories slowly returning, despite what felt like a powerful effort to suppress them. I began to remember being taken from my campsite by people who moved through the forest with unnatural silence and coordination. I remembered being transported through underground tunnels connecting different parts of the mountain, and being held in a facility that was definitely not any kind of legitimate research installation. I also began to remember other people brought to the same facility, other hikers and campers who had disappeared in the area over the years. Some of them had been there much longer than me and showed clear signs of repeated procedures and long-term imprisonment. I remembered being told that I was being prepared for something, but even now I can never quite recall what that something was. When I tried to report these recovered memories to law enforcement, I was met with skepticism and dismissed. I was told there was no evidence of any underground facilities in the area, and that my experiences were likely the result of trauma-induced hallucinations or false memories. The official explanation for my disappearance became that I had simply become disoriented, wandered away from my campsite, and suffered a head injury that caused temporary amnesia. But I know, with every fiber of my being, that explanation isn't true. Something profound and terrifying happened to me during those 3 missing days. Something that involved people or entities with technology and capabilities far beyond what should exist in a remote national park. The physical evidence on my body, the surgical scars and injection sites, proves unequivocally that I didn't simply wander around the forest in a confused state for 3 days. I have never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains, and I probably never will. But sometimes, late at night, in the quiet darkness, I recall fragments of conversations and procedures that convince me whatever was done to me during those missing days isn't finished yet. The fear isn't just a lingering memory, it's a persistent shadow that follows me everywhere. Every strange noise, every fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision makes me wonder if they've returned, if they're watching. I meticulously examine my scalp regularly, convinced I'll find new marks, and I check my arms for any fresh injection sites. The medical explanation offered by the authorities feels like a flimsy, convenient cover-up, and I know, deep in my bones, that I'm not crazy. There's a part of me that feels subtly altered, as if something fundamental was changed during those lost days. It's not just the fear, but a persistent sense of unease, a gnawing feeling that I'm no longer entirely my own. The whispers from those dreams still echo, a constant hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. And I can't shake the chilling notion that my experience in the Great Smokies was just the prologue to something much larger, something I'm still caught in the middle of. whether I remember every detail or not. The thought that countless others might be out there, experiencing the same bewildering abductions and memory gaps, drives me to speak out, even if no one believes me. The storm erupted without warning, catching me completely off guard and forcing me to seek shelter, any shelter I could find. My name is Jonathan Miller from Seattle, Washington, and what transpired during that terrifying storm in the mountains of North Carolina will forever haunt my waking thoughts and my darkest dreams. I was 34 at the time, a freelance photographer with a passion for capturing the raw beauty of landscapes and nature. I had driven cross-country, drawn by the vibrant fall foliage of the Blue Ridge Mountains, with plans to spend 2 weeks immersed in camping and hiking through their most remote and breathtaking corners. It was my third day deep within the mountains when the weather took a violent, almost malevolent turn. I had been photographing an old, abandoned homestead, nestled about 8 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough logging path that snaked its way deep into the national forest. The morning had been gloriously clear and bright, perfect for the atmospheric shots I hoped to capture. But by early afternoon, dark, heavy clouds were rapidly building over the western peaks. Mountain weather can shift quickly, but this storm system felt particularly ominous, its impending arrival chilling me to the bone. The clouds were an unsettling, sickly dark green I'd never witnessed before, moving across the sky far faster than seemed natural. Within mere minutes, the temperature plummeted at least 20 degrees, and the wind began to howl through the ancient trees with a sound like a freight train barreling through the valley. I had initially planned to hike back to my campsite before the storm hit, but the rapid escalation of the weather made me realize I wouldn't make it. The first raindrops were already falling, unusually forceful, hitting the ground and leaves around me like small, stinging bullets. Lightning began to flash ominously in the distance, and the thunder that followed was so deafening it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Desperately, I scanned my surroundings for any possible shelter and spotted what appeared to be a cabin, perched about half a mile up the mountainside. It was partially obscured by the dense forest, but I could clearly see smoke rising from its chimney, a beacon of hope suggesting someone was home and might offer refuge from the escalating tempest. I quickly gathered my expensive camera equipment and started running toward the cabin just as the sky ripped open, unleashing a true deluge. The rain was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. It wasn't merely heavy, it was violent, pouring down so relentlessly that seeing more than a few feet in any direction became an impossible task. The wind gusted strong enough to repeatedly knock me off balance, and lightning struck constantly, transforming the dark afternoon into a strobing nightmare of blinding light and deep, impenetrable shadow. By the time I finally reached the cabin, I was utterly soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. The structure was older than it had appeared from a distance, probably built sometime in the 1940s or 50s, with a noticeably sagging roof and windows covered by what looked like newspaper from the inside. Yet, someone was definitely home. I could see lamplight flickering through gaps in the newspaper, and smoke still rose steadily from the chimney despite the driving torrential rain. I pounded on the front door, shouting over the roar of the wind and rain, explaining that I was a hiker caught in the storm and desperately needed shelter. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no response, and I began to fear that no one had heard my desperate pleas above the cacophony. Then I heard faint footsteps inside, and the door slowly opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with long gray streaked hair and eyes that seemed unnervingly bright in the dim lamplight. She looked me up and down without a single word, her gaze taking in my drenched clothes and expensive camera gear. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. I thanked her profusely as I stumbled inside, dripping water all over her worn floor and profusely apologizing for the intrusion. She closed the heavy door behind me and turned several thick, clanking locks that I hadn't even noticed from the outside. The cabin's interior was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps and a crackling fire in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows. It was sparsely furnished with handmade pieces that looked decades old, weathered and worn, and the walls were adorned with animal pelts and what appeared to be hunting trophies. But something felt distinctly off about these trophies. They weren't normal deer heads or bear pelts. Some of the skulls were oddly shaped, too elongated, or disturbingly filled with too many teeth. and the pelts displayed patterns and colors that didn't match any animals I recognized or had ever seen. The woman introduced herself as Mary and said I was welcome to stay until the storm passed. She offered me a rough towel and a cup of what she called herbal tea, which tasted remarkably bitter and had an unsettling aftertaste reminiscent of strong medicine. She seemed friendly enough on the surface, but there was an unsettling quality to her manner, a subtle disquiet. She kept staring at me with those unnervingly bright eyes, and had a peculiar habit of smiling at entirely inappropriate moments, like when I mentioned my worry about flash floods or the terrifying possibility of being struck by lightning. As I sat by the fire, trying my best to warm up and dry my sodden clothes, I gradually became aware that Mary wasn't alone in the cabin. I could distinctly hear movement in the back rooms, faint footsteps and occasional voices too quiet and muffled for me to decipher. When I cautiously asked if other family members lived there, Mary's unsettling smile widened, and she said I would meet them soon enough. The storm outside continued to rage with an undiminished fury, showing no signs of letting up. The wind howled so loudly around the cabin that any attempt at normal conversation became difficult, and lightning strikes were so frequent that the entire structure lit up in stark relief every few seconds. Mary calmly explained that storms in these mountains could last for hours, sometimes even days, and that I might very well need to stay the night if conditions didn't miraculously improve. That's when I met the rest of the family. The first to emerge from the shadowed back rooms was a man who appeared to be Mary's husband. He was tall and gaunt, with long matted hair that looked unwashed for weeks, and clothes stained with substances I didn't even want to begin to identify. He moved with a strange, shambling gait, and when he looked at me, his eyes possessed the same unnaturally bright, unsettling quality as Mary's. He was followed by what I initially mistakenly thought were their children. But as they approached the flickering firelight, a profound sense of wrongness washed over me. There were 3 younger people, likely in their 20s or 30s, but all had severe physical deformities suggesting deep-seated genetic issues. One had arms of noticeably different lengths, another had severely asymmetrical facial features that contorted his expression, and the third moved with a pronounced limp, indicating major spinal or leg problems. All of them stared at me with the same bright, unsettling, vacant eyes, and none of them spoke a single word. Mary introduced them simply as her family, but didn't bother to give any names. She explained, with that unnerving smile, that they didn't get many visitors in their remote location and were always excited to meet new people who might be able to stay for a while. The way she emphasized "stay for a while" sent a chilling shiver down my spine, a cold dread seeping into my bones. I began to suspect, with growing terror, that visitors to this isolated cabin might not always be free to leave when they wished. I forced a strained smile and told Mary I genuinely appreciated their hospitality, but I needed to return to my campsite as soon as the storm passed, as people would surely worry if I didn't check in. Mary merely smiled again and casually remarked that the storm was just beginning, and it might be days before it was truly safe to travel through the treacherous mountains again. She then suggested I make myself comfortable because I was going to be their guest for quite some time. It was at that horrifying moment I noticed something else. All the windows in the cabin weren't just covered with newspaper from the inside, they were also heavily boarded up from the outside. The thick, clanking locks on the front door were clearly designed to keep people in, not to keep unwanted visitors out. And the hunting trophies on the walls, they weren't from animals at all, they were from people. My blood ran cold as I recognized human skulls that had been crudely modified and decorated to resemble animal remains. Scalps with hair still attached hung next to what I had initially assumed were deer pelts. In the flickering, deceptive lamplight, I could now discern faded, disturbing photographs tacked to the wall, showing previous guests who had, like me, sought shelter in this cabin during storms. The family still stood in a silent semicircle around me, their bright, predatory eyes fixed on my face. Mary began explaining in a calm, chilling voice that they had developed their own unique ways of surviving in these remote mountains, ways that didn't rely on the outside world for anything they needed. She said they had learned to utilize everything that came their way, including chillingly unexpected visitors caught in bad weather. The stark, horrifying realization slammed into me. I was in grave danger, trapped, and needed to escape this cabin immediately, storm or no storm. I blurted out, trying to sound casual, that I'd suddenly remembered needing to retrieve some important equipment from my car before the weather worsened further. Mary laughed, a harsh grating sound, claiming my car was probably already washed away by flash flooding, and even if it wasn't, I'd never find it in the dark in the raging storm. She was probably right, but I knew with a certainty born of sheer terror that I had to try. I stood up, my muscles tense, and moved toward the door, but the man I'd assumed was Mary's husband stepped swiftly in front of me and shook his head, a silent, menacing gesture. He held something behind his back, and when he brought it forward, my stomach dropped. It was a length of thick rope with a noose already tied. The three younger family members moved with unnerving speed to block the other potential exits from the main room, forming a formidable barrier. Mary continued talking, her voice eerily calm, about how they were going to take good care of me and make sure I became a permanent part of their mountain family. She explained that the storm was a gift that had brought me to them, just as it had brought so many others over the years. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had only one chance to escape, and I had to seize it immediately before they could restrain me. The front door was still my best and only option, even with the man with rope blocking my path. I feigned a sudden stumble, collapsing dramatically toward the fireplace. In one desperate, adrenaline-fueled motion, I grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire and swung it at him as hard as I possibly could. The flaming log struck him across the face and neck. He screamed, a raw, animal sound of pain, and fell backward, dropping the rope and clutching his burned skin in agony. Without hesitation, I kicked over one of the oil lamps, splashing burning fuel across the wooden floor, then threw my full weight against the front door. The locks were strong, built to withstand, but the old rotting wood around them wasn't. The door frame splintered and gave way with a sickening crack, and I burst out into the raging storm, gasping for breath. Behind me, I could hear the family screaming and cursing, their voices mingling with the wind, and I could see flames beginning to spread rapidly across the cabin floor, illuminated by the flashes of lightning. I ran into the storm and never looked back. The freezing rain, which moments before had felt like a suffocating threat, now felt like a cleansing torrent, washing away the horrifying images of the cabin from my mind, though not from my memory. Every blinding flash of lightning illuminated a path through the thrashing trees, guiding my desperate headlong flight. The mountain, once a place of serene beauty and quiet contemplation, had transformed into a menacing, treacherous labyrinth, its sounds now a terrifying symphony of the wind's howl, the thunder's roar, and the echoes of those monstrous screams. I pushed through the relentless wind, the stinging rain, and the agonizing fear that Mary and her grotesque family might be pursuing me. Their bright, predatory eyes burned into my memory with an indelible mark. My lungs burned with exertion, my legs ached with every pounding step, but the primal, overwhelming urge to survive drove me forward, relentlessly. I don't know how long I ran or in what exact direction, only that I kept moving, a desperate, broken man, until the first faint, ethereal hint of dawn painted the tumultuous sky. When I finally stumbled onto a paved road, soaked, shivering violently, and barely coherent, the world outside that nightmare cabin seemed impossibly bright and welcoming. Yet it was forever tainted by the profound darkness I had witnessed. The experience shattered my perception of safety and the idyllic innocence of nature, and even now, years later, the faintest scent of wood smoke or the distant rumble of thunder can send a cold, paralyzing dread through my bones, instantly transporting me back to that horrific night I outran a horror far more profound and terrifying than any storm. I'm a geologist, and when I stumbled upon that entrance, my inherent curiosity simply took over. My name is Dr. Patricia Williams, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. What I unearthed in those desolate mine shafts, nestled deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, will undoubtedly haunt me for the rest of my days. I'd been conducting a geological survey for a mining company, assessing the structural integrity of old coal extraction sites, long abandoned since the 1970s. My task was to determine if they could be safely expanded for modern operations. For 3 weeks, I'd been meticulously mapping and photographing dozens of neglected mine entrances scattered across the rugged terrain. Most were exactly what you'd expect: dark, partially collapsed tunnels that extended only a few hundred feet before becoming too hazardous to explore further. But this particular mine was different. I felt it the moment I first laid eyes on it. Its entrance was significantly larger than any other I'd surveyed, and more disturbingly, it showed undeniable signs of recent activity. Activity that simply shouldn't have been possible for a mine supposedly abandoned for nearly 50 years. Fresh tire tracks marred the dirt leading up to the opening, and someone had recently cleared away the thick vegetation and debris that should have accumulated over decades of neglect. Most tellingly, an electrical conduit snaked directly into the tunnel, suggesting modern lighting and possibly other equipment had been installed inside. My initial thought was that local authorities, or perhaps even the previous mining company, were conducting their own safety inspections or environmental assessments. But when I cross-referenced my records and contacted the original operators, I discovered that no one had been authorized to access the site in over 2 decades. The local sheriff's department also had no record of any recent activity in the area. This presented a profound dilemma. As a professional geologist on an official survey, I was obligated to document all existing mine infrastructure. However, if this particular mine was being used for unauthorized purposes, I knew I could be walking into a genuinely dangerous situation. After considerable deliberation, I decided that my scientific curiosity and professional obligations outweighed my personal safety concerns. I meticulously equipped myself with all the standard safety gear for underground exploration: a hard hat with a mounted light, backup flashlights, a portable air quality monitor, an emergency beacon, and enough water and emergency supplies to last several hours underground. I also brought my digital camera and measuring equipment, determined to document whatever I found. The electrical conduit extended about 200 feet into the tunnel before connecting to a series of professionally installed work lights along the ceiling. Someone had clearly invested significant time and money into making this supposedly abandoned mine accessible and functional. The tunnel itself was in remarkably good condition, with timber supports that appeared recently reinforced and a cleared leveled floor. As I ventured deeper, following the conduit and the line of work lights, I began to notice side passages branching off the main tunnel. These seemed to be original mining corridors, but several had been modified with new metal doors that looked utterly out of place in an old coal mine. They were heavy steel constructions, fortified with multiple locking mechanisms, more akin to what you'd find in a high-security facility than an industrial mine. My air quality monitor registered normal oxygen levels and no dangerous gases, so I pressed onward. About half a mile from the entrance, I reached what appeared to be the main excavation area where the original coal extraction had occurred. But instead of the empty cavern I expected, I found a sophisticated underground facility constructed within the natural mining chambers. There were multiple rooms, expertly carved out of the rock walls and fitted with startlingly modern amenities: electric lighting, ventilation systems, running water, and what appeared to be laboratory equipment. The construction was of professional quality, clearly the work of experienced contractors with access to specialized underground building techniques. This was no amateur operation cobbled together by local criminals or drug manufacturers. Then, in the largest of these underground rooms, I found something that rendered my scientific training completely irrelevant. Along one wall were dozens of metal filing cabinets, overflowing with documents, photographs, and what seemed to be medical records. The documents dated back to the 1940s and continued right up to within the past few months. They meticulously detailed some kind of long-term research project that had been conducted in this very location for over 70 years. The photographs were, by far, the most disturbing part. They depicted people of various ages, from young children to elderly adults, who appeared to be subjects in horrific medical or psychological experiments. Many showed obvious signs of physical distress, malnutrition, and what looked like surgical procedures performed without any proper medical care. The more recent photographs were in color, offering chillingly clear details of procedures that violated every ethical standard of human medical research imaginable. According to the documents, the research project had been initiated in the 1940s as part of a government program to study the effects of isolation, sensory deprivation, and various experimental drugs on human subjects. The original funding had come from federal agencies, but by the 1960s, the project had apparently transferred to private contractors who continued the research without official oversight or approval. The subjects appeared to be people who would not be missed by the outside world, homeless individuals, runaway teenagers, and people with mental illness who had been institutionalized. Many files indicated subjects had been told they were participating in legitimate medical studies or job training programs. But once they arrived at the facility, they had been held against their will and subjected to procedures that could only be described as torture. The most recent files showed that the project was still active and that new subjects were being brought to the facility regularly. There were detailed records of how subjects were recruited, transported to the mine, and processed through various experimental protocols. Many of the recent entries mentioned subjects acquired from hiking trails, campgrounds, and other outdoor recreation areas throughout the Appalachian region. It was then I fully grasped the horrifying truth. I had stumbled onto undeniable evidence of a decades-long criminal conspiracy involving kidnapping, human experimentation, and very likely murder on an unimaginable scale. I immediately began photographing as many documents as possible, desperate to create a comprehensive record of my discovery before reporting it to law enforcement. That's when I heard voices emanating from one of the side passages. My heart leaped into my throat. I quickly switched off my headlamp and crouched behind one of the filing cabinets, trying to remain as utterly quiet as possible while the voices grew closer. There were at least 3 people discussing schedules and procedures with the clinical, professional demeanor of individuals completely comfortable with the monstrous actions. One mentioned preparing for a new arrival later that evening. They casually debated which experimental protocol would be most appropriate for this particular subject and discussed optimal dosage levels for the drugs they planned to administer. They spoke about human beings as if they were laboratory animals, with no recognition whatsoever that they were planning to torture and likely kill another person. The voices came from a passage leading even deeper into the mine, towards areas I had not yet explored. I realized there were likely additional rooms and facilities beyond what I had already discovered, and that current victims might be held in those areas right now. I was faced with an impossible choice. The rational thing would have been to leave the mine immediately, drive to the nearest town with cell service, and contact federal law enforcement agencies about my discovery. But if people were being held captive in the deeper parts of the mine, they might be moved or killed before authorities could even organize a rescue operation. I decided, in that terrifying moment, to try and gather more information about the current situation before leaving to contact law enforcement. I waited until the voices faded, then carefully made my way toward the passage where I had heard them speaking. The electrical conduit continued in that direction, a chilling testament to additional facilities deeper in the mine. What I found in those deeper chambers was worse than anything I could have possibly imagined. There were holding cells containing people in various states of physical and psychological distress. Some appeared heavily drugged or sedated. Others were conscious but showed harrowing signs of prolonged abuse and malnutrition. All of them bore identification numbers tattooed on their arms, like inventory in some horrific human warehouse. The people rue. This facility had transformed an abandoned coal mine into a sophisticated underground prison where they could conduct illegal human experiments without any risk of discovery by outside authorities. They had been operating for decades, perfecting their methods and expanding their capabilities, all while remaining completely invisible to the outside world. I knew I had to document everything I could, and then get out of there immediately to contact law enforcement. But as I was taking photographs of the holding cells, I heard footsteps behind me and realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that I had been discovered by whoever was running this nightmarish facility. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life, a blur of adrenaline and desperate flight, but somehow I managed to escape from the mine and make it back to my vehicle. I drove straight to the FBI field office in Lexington and turned over all the photographs and documentation I had gathered. The federal investigation that followed led to the arrest of 12 people and the rescue of 17 victims who had been held captive in that chilling underground facility. But the relief of their rescue is always tempered by a persistent, gnawing fear. I know, deep in my bones, that what I discovered was just one small, horrific part of a much larger, insidious network of similar operations hidden throughout the remote, forgotten corners of the Appalachian Mountains. The images of those innocent faces, the blank stares of the drugged, the raw terror in the eyes of the conscious, they replay in my mind every night. I find little solace in sleep. My geological career, once my singular passion, now feels trivial. This experience has irrevocably altered my perspective, forcing me to confront the darkest depths of human cruelty and the terrifying reality that such evil can thrive, unnoticed, in the very heart of our soci. Thank you. I speak out whenever I can, driven by a desperate hope that by sharing this story, others might become more vigilant, more questioning, and perhaps more able to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The fight is far from over. It has only just begun. Growing up, my Appalachian grandmother, Mima Sarah, used to spin the most incredible tales. I believed they were just charming mountain folklore, the kind of imaginative stories that fill long, dark evenings. That was until 2 years ago. My name is Kevin O'Brien, and I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. What happened to me in the mountains of Southwest Virginia proved with terrifying certainty that some old legends are rooted in a reality far more chilling than any fireside story. Mima Sarah had grown up in those very mountains before moving south in the 1950s, and she often spoke of something she called the Fiddle Man, a mysterious figure whose music could drive people to madness. According to Mima Sarah, the Fiddle Man was an ancient spirit, a being who had roamed those hollows long before any white settlers arrived. He appeared as a tall, impossibly thin man dressed in clothes that felt centuries out of time, always with a fiddle crafted from materials no earthly artisan could ever hope to shape. She'd swear his music was the most beautiful, most haunting sound imaginable, a melody that would seep into your very bones. But listen for too long, she warned, and it would steal your mind, leaving you to wander the mountains forever, drawn deeper and deeper into places no human should ever tread. She told me of her own grandfather's encounter back in 1923. He was hunting alone near their family homestead when he heard the fiddle. He followed the sound for hours, utterly lost in the wilderness, until he finally snapped back to his senses just before dawn. He had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there. It took him 2 agonizing days to find his way home. For the rest of his life, she said, he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence, head tilted, as if listening to a distant melody only he could hear. I had always dismissed these stories as colorful family lore, the kind of rich narratives that naturally flourish in isolated communities needing to entertain themselves. But when Mima Sarah passed away last year, she left me her old family homestead nestled deep in those Virginia mountains, along with a stark, handwritten letter. It warned me never to stay there alone after dark, and especially not when the mountain laurel was in bloom. As a music producer specializing in traditional American folk music, the idea of owning property in the heart of Appalachian musical culture was incredibly appealing, irresistible even. I decided to spend a long weekend at the homestead, partly to assess its condition and partly to try and record some truly authentic mountain music in the very region my family had called home for generations. The homestead itself was tucked away in a narrow hollow aptly named Devil's Backbone, a good 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The original log cabin, built in the 1880s, had seen several expansions but had been vacant for nearly 20 years and desperately needed repairs. There was no electricity or running water, but a good well provided fresh water, and the massive stone fireplace still worked perfectly. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late May, just as Mima Sarah's letter had warned. The mountain laurel was indeed in full, spectacular bloom, painting the surrounding forest with breathtaking displays of white and pink. I spent the day cleaning out the cabin and setting up my recording equipment, planning to document the natural sounds of the mountains that evening, and perhaps interview some locals about traditional music and folklore. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows, I built a comforting fire in the stone fireplace. I settled in with my digital recorders, hoping to capture the ambient sounds of the mountain. Evening, the hoot of owls, the calls of night birds, perhaps the rhythmic chirps of musical insects common in Appalachian forests during late spring. What I recorded instead was something I still cannot fully comprehend. It began around 10 o'clock that night, a faint, ethereal melody drifting from somewhere deeper within the hollow. At first, I rationalized it, thinking it might be a distant neighbor playing music on their porch. But the nearest house was over 2 miles away, and this sound was undeniably emanating from the uninhabited forest surrounding my grandmother's property. The melody, played on what sounded like a fiddle, possessed a purity and resonance unlike any traditional instrument I'd ever heard. Its harmonics seemed to linger in the air, vibrating long after each note faded. It was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any mountain music I'd ever encountered, and it seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural sounds of the forest, an organic part of the wild night. I immediately hit record, convinced I had stumbled upon precisely the kind of authentic mountain music I'd been seeking, a true gem for my collection. The melody was complex, sophisticated, clearly the work of a master musician who understood traditional Appalachian forms but was pushing them into directions that felt both ancient and utterly original. As I listened more carefully, I began to recognize elements from old ballads and fiddle tunes Mima Sarah had sung to me as a child. But this musician was weaving them together in ways that created entirely new compositions, building intricate musical narratives that seemed to tell stories about the very history and legends of these mountains. The music continued for over an hour, and I found myself utterly absorbed, following the intricate melodies and variations, captivated. I forgot about everything else, simply sitting by the fire, listening and recording, feeling as though I was experiencing something magical and unprecedented in my entire career. That's when an icy prickle of unease started creeping in. The music was drawing closer. What had begun as distant melodies from deep within the forest was now clearly being played much nearer to the cabin. I distinctly heard footsteps on the wooden porch, a slow, deliberate pace back and forth, the music never faltering. The fiddle was now so clear, so immediate, it sounded as if it were right outside the front door. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch, half expecting to greet some local musician who had heard my recording equipment and decided to share some traditional mountain hospitality. But no one was there. The porch was empty. I scanned the clearing around the cabin but saw no one, yet the music persisted, now seeming to emanate from different directions, as if the musician was circling the property, playing all the while. Driven by an irresistible curiosity, I followed the sound with my flashlight, desperate to catch sight of whoever was creating this incredible music. But I saw no one. The melody began to change, growing more complex, more demanding, with rapid passages that bespoke extraordinary technical skill. But there was also something deeply hypnotic about it, something that made it incredibly difficult to focus on anything else. I found myself walking away from the cabin, deeper into the forest, without consciously deciding to do so. A jolt of cold realization hit me. My grandmother's warnings, her grandfather following the fiddle music until he was utterly lost. I forced myself to stop walking, to fight the compulsion, to turn back toward the cabin. But when I looked around, panic flared. I could no longer see the comforting glow of the fireplace. I couldn't recall which direction I had come from. The music was all around me now. See me. It come from every direction at once, a swirling, suffocating soundscape. The melody was building, reaching a terrifying crescendo, becoming more intense and overwhelming with each passing moment. I felt my grip on rational thought slipping, becoming absorbed in the music to the point where nothing else seemed to matter, nothing else existed. That's when I saw him. He stood about 30 feet away, partially obscured by the deep shadows between two massive oak trees. He was tall, impossibly thin, dressed in clothes that looked like they might have been fashionable in the 1800s, a long black coat, dark trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that swallowed his face in shadow. In his hands, the fiddle seemed to gleam with its own pale light, even in the oppressive darkness of the forest. I couldn't see his features clearly, but I could feel his gaze directly on me as he continued to play. The music undeniably originated from his fiddle, yet it sounded as if it were amplified by the entire forest, resonating through the trees and rocks, creating harmonics that no normal instrument could ever produce. As I stared at him, transfixed by the impossible, terrifying beauty of the music, he began to walk deeper into the forest, never stopping his playing, never taking his eyes off me. An overwhelming compulsion seized me, to follow him, to hear more of this incredible music, to discover where it would lead. I took several steps toward him before Mima Sarah's urgent warning screamed in my mind, and the memory of the recording equipment still running back at the cabin jolted me. With an enormous, agonizing effort, I tore my gaze away from the fiddle man. I turned and ran, blindly, back toward the homestead, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the encroaching darkness. The music continued behind me, growing fainter, but never, ever completely fading away. I stumbled back, into the cabin, and immediately began gathering my recording equipment, planning to leave the mountains that very night, despite the darkness and the treacherous, unpaved roads. As I frantically packed my gear, I decided to quickly check some of what I had recorded earlier that evening. What I heard shocked me to my core. The digital recording contained over an hour of the most beautiful fiddle music I had ever encountered, every note as pure and resonant as I remembered. But there was something else in the audio, something I hadn't noticed while it was happening, something that had been hidden beneath the melody. Human voices, dozens of them, barely audible, singing along with the fiddle music in harmonies that sounded like they were coming from very far away, yet unnervingly close. And then, a chilling recognition. I heard what sounded exactly like my grandmother, Mima Sarah, singing lullabies she had taught me as a child. But my grandmother had been dead for over a year. The recording had been made mere hours ago, tonight. I drove out of those mountains before dawn, the tires of my truck spitting gravel on the winding dirt roads, never looking back. I have never returned to my family's homestead. I still have the recordings. They're locked away in a fireproof safe, a constant, horrifying reminder. But I've never been able to bring myself to listen to them again, not even a single second, nor could I ever share them with anyone else. Some music is simply too dangerous to be heard, and some family legends, it turns out, are based on truths that are far, far better left buried in the past, undisturbed and forgotten. The experience fundamentally fractured my perception of reality. I am no longer just a music producer, I am a witness to the impossible. The memory of that music, of that figure in the shadows, haunts my every quiet moment, a silent internal echo. I find myself glancing over my shoulder, perpetually listening. I thought I was prepared. I had the best GPS, a satellite phone, all the cutting-edge gear a wilderness expert could ask for. Yet none of it mattered when I stumbled upon something in those mountains that seemed to understand and counteract every single piece of technology I carried. My name is Michael Chang, and I'm from San Francisco, California. For over 15 years, I've prided myself on being an expert in wilderness survival and backcountry navigation, leading training courses, testing equipment, and exploring some of the wildest corners of North America. What happened to me last fall, deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, didn't just challenge, it shattered everything I believed about survival in the modern age. I was there under contract, tasked by a major outdoor equipment manufacturer to put their newest line of high-tech survival gear through the ultimate field test under extreme wilderness conditions. This wasn't just any equipment, we're talking military-grade GPS with satellite connectivity, an emergency beacon that could pinpoint my location globally, a thermal imaging scope, night vision goggles, and a satellite communication device designed to keep me in touch with civilization from literally anywhere on Earth. My job was simple: spend 2 weeks completely alone in the most remote part of the Cherokee National Forest, documenting how each piece of gear performed for potential military and civilian buyers. I had deliberately chosen an area over 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a grueling hike through incredibly rugged terrain, steep ridges, dense forest, and countless stream crossings. My topographic maps and satellite imagery confirmed it. No established trails, no camping areas, no sign of human activity for decades. It was, I believed, the perfect, isolated, and challenging environment to truly stress test this advanced equipment. The first 3 days unfolded exactly as planned. I set up my base camp in a natural clearing, found a reliable water source, tested the GPS and communication devices, and began meticulously documenting their performance. Everything worked flawlessly. I was honestly impressed by how much easier modern technology made wilderness survival compared to traditional methods. My GPS unit gave me precise location data, displaying detailed maps on its crisp, high-resolution screen. The satellite phone kept me in clear communication with my support team back in California, allowing me to send daily status reports and equipment evaluations. With the thermal imaging and night vision gear, I could navigate and even hunt effectively, even in absolute darkness. I felt completely in control, supremely confident that I could handle any emergency situation that might arise. That confidence evaporated on the fourth night. I woke up abruptly to a terrifying realization. Every single piece of electronic equipment had stopped working simultaneously. The GPS unit was completely dead, its screen blank despite having a full battery charge just hours before. My satellite phone wouldn't power on. When I removed and reinserted the battery, it displayed error messages I'd never seen in any manual. The thermal scope and night vision goggles were equally useless, showing only static or completely black screens. My initial thought was electromagnetic interference, a solar storm perhaps, or some secret military testing. But then I checked my backup mechanical devices, my compass and altimeter. They too were malfunctioning in ways that defied all scientific explanation. The compass needle spun wildly, never settling. The altimeter showed readings varying by thousands of feet within minutes, even though I hadn't changed elevation. Even my mechanical wristwatch had stopped dead, frozen at 3:17 a.m., precisely when I first noticed the failures. I spent the entire morning trying to troubleshoot, checking batteries, connections, and settings according to the manufacturer's instructions. Nothing worked. It was as if something was actively interfering with both electronic and mechanical devices, using methods beyond any natural phenomenon I could possibly identify. Without GPS navigation or communication, I was effectively stranded in one of the most remote parts of the eastern United States. But I'd faced similar situations before, relying only on traditional survival methods, and I was sure I could navigate back to civilization using natural landmarks and basic orienteering. That confidence crumbled when I realized the landscape itself seemed to be shifting around me. My base camp clearing and the stream were still there, but the surrounding terrain looked utterly different from how it had appeared just days before. Hills and ridges I'd carefully marked on my maps were no longer in their correct positions relative to my camp. The stream flowed in a different direction, and distinctive rock formations I had planned to use as navigation points had either moved or vanished entirely. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself I was disoriented from the stress. But when I climbed to the highest point nearby for a better view, I could see it clearly. The entire landscape was subtly, yet undeniably, different from what my maps said it should be. Even more disturbing was the growing certainty that I was being watched. It started as a feeling, an uncomfortable prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation of unseen eyes. As the day wore on, I began catching glimpses of movement at the very edge of my peripheral vision, always darting away the moment I turned my head. By evening, I was certain something was stalking me, deliberately staying hidden while monitoring my every move. Whatever it was, it moved through the forest with absolute silence, never rustling a leaf or snapping a twig. But I could feel its presence, circling my campsite from a distance, observing everything I did. That night, driven by a desperate need to know, I decided to use my night vision equipment to identify my stalker. But when I powered on the goggles, instead of the familiar green-tinted view of the forest, I saw something that simply defied explanation. The landscape looked normal through the device, but there were additional elements, things completely invisible to the naked eye. I could see what looked like structures in the forest, geometric patterns and artificial constructions that occupied the same space as trees and rocks, yet were somehow separate from the natural environment. Even more unsettling were the figures. At least a dozen humanoid shapes moved through the forest around my camp, but they weren't quite human. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that suggested their joints and limbs functioned outside the bounds of normal anatomy. When I took off the goggles, I saw only normal forest. But when I put them back on, the strange structures and figures were there again, seemingly existing in some spectrum of reality only perceptible through the modified electronics of the night vision system. It was then I understood. My high-tech equipment hadn't simply malfunctioned due to electromagnetic interference or some defect. Something had deliberately modified these devices to show me things that existed right alongside our normal physical world, but were usually hidden from human perception. The entities stalking me weren't just observing, they were manipulating my gear, demonstrating their technological capabilities and company, communicating that they were far more advanced than anything human science had ever conceived. Over the next few days, their manipulation of my equipment became even more sophisticated and clearly intentional. My GPS unit began displaying locations that weren't on any earthly map, showing coordinates that placed me on other continents, even other planets. The satellite phone received calls from numbers with too many digits, transmitting voices speaking in languages that didn't sound human. Most unsettling of all, the thermal imaging scope started showing heat signatures of the entities themselves, They appeared not as normal human or animal heat patterns, but as complex, shifting geometric designs, suggesting these beings existed in dimensions or states of matter that our technology could only partially detect. I tried to leave the area multiple times, but each attempt only led me further astray and more disoriented. The terrain continued to shift around me, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing without any logical pattern. My compass and GPS offered contradictory information, sometimes indicating I was walking in circles, other times suggesting I was traveling in directions that simply didn't exist on any normal map. After a week trapped in this impossible landscape, I finally came face to face with one of the entities. It approached my campsite just before dawn, moving with the fluid, silent grace I'd witnessed through the night vision. Up close, it was unmistakably not human, though it maintained a roughly humanoid form. It stood over 7 feet tall, with proportions subtly wrong in a way that made it profoundly uncomfortable to look at directly. The entity didn't speak in words, yet it somehow communicated a chilling message. I was being tested, and through me, humanity was being evaluated for its readiness to confront technologies and forms of existence beyond our current understanding. My modern survival equipment, it implied, had been altered to serve as interfaces for this test, allowing them to observe how I, a human expert, would react to phenomena that directly challenged my deepest assumptions about reality and technology. The entity then indicated that I was free to leave, but warned that my equipment would continue to function differently, occasionally providing glimpses into the larger reality that coexisted with our normal human world. When I finally found my way back to civilization 2 weeks later, exhausted and changed forever, I discovered a profound paradox. According to my support team in California, my satellite phone had been transmitting my location accurately the entire time. From their perspective, I had simply been camping at the predetermined location and had maintained regular contact throughout my stay in the mountains. But my equipment still, to this day, sometimes shows me things that should not exist. And I now understand with chilling clarity that human technology is far, far more primitive than we realize. This experience didn't just alter my perception of reality, it shattered it. I can no longer look at the world through the same eyes. Every piece of equipment, every map, every scientific principle I once held sacred now feels like a thin veil covering an infinitely more complex and unsettling truth. The very notion of wilderness survival seems almost quaint, overshadowed by the realization that there are intelligences, or perhaps even natural phenomena, capable of bending perception and manipulating our most advanced tools at will. It forces one to question the fundamental nature of space, time, and consciousness. Are we merely scratching the surface of existence, limited by our biological senses and the rudimentary technology we invent? Or are we, as the entity suggested, Bane? Carefully observed, our technological progress, a slow, deliberate test to see when we might finally be ready to glimpse what truly lies beyond our current understanding. The fear has subsided somewhat, replaced by a profound sense of awe and an unsettling curiosity. I still venture into the wild, but now every rustle, every shadow, every flicker on a digital screen carries a new, deeper meaning. I'm no longer just surviving, I'm forever listening, forever watching for those fleeting glimpses of the larger reality that now haunt my every waking moment. The wilderness is no longer just a place of earthly challenges, it's a gateway, and I've been given a glimpse of what lies on the other side.